this is a great pleasure. I'm looking forward to this one. As some of you probably recognize, I'm here with somebody who I've had several profound and joyful conversations with, DC Schindler. And I'm also joined by somebody who makes use of David's work and has written an astonishing book, The Vision of the Soul, Truth, Goodness, and Beauty in the Western Tradition. This is James Matthew Wilson. What I'm going to do is just give a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. Then I'll ask each one of you to introduce yourself. I'm first going to mention a couple books that might come up by David, which is Love in the Postmodern Predicament. Many of you know I've used that book in a couple of my courses. And then also a book I've called my all-time favorite book on Plato's Republic, which is Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, which is astonishing. So just to get things like that out of the way, we're going to be talking about what James's book is about, which is the vision of the soul. What does this mean anymore? Does it mean anything? Does it mean anything in the age of modernity? Does it mean anything when reason has been reduced, when logos is merely computational logic and knowledge is just the correctness of how our representations happen to correspond to reality in a way that does not challenge us to any kind of cultivation of transformation or transcendence? Does the vision of the soul mean anything? As many of you know, I've been arguing very extensively that it does. And so David has had a huge influence on me. I've taught 2 courses for the Peterson Academy, one on the primacy of beauty and then the next one on the centrality of goodness. And if those of you who know David's work know that I was deliberately and explicitly referring to his work, both in Love in the Postmodern Predicament and the Catholicity of Reason. And I am going to be making reference to James's book in a course I'm going to be teaching on my lectern on East and West on Zen Neoplatonism, because I think it gives us some excellent James, you did this thing where you give like these it's like 6 insights into the tradition, which I think are just gems and absolutely wonderful. So we're going to be wrestling with the vision of the soul, the true, the good, the beautiful, the intelligible, realness, and the difference between a theoretical conception of those and perhaps a phenomenological apprehension of them. And so first of all, welcome, gentlemen. David, could we begin with you, and then we'll go over to James?
Sure. Thank you, John. It's really great to have a conversation with you again. My name is David Schindler. I use the pen name DC Schindler, originally as a way of distinguishing myself from my father, who also worked in philosophy and theology. I teach at the John Paul II Institute that focus principally on metaphysics and philosophical anthropology. And the themes of the transcendentals, beauty, truth, and goodness have always been central for me, or primary or ultimate, depending on how you look at them. But that's been a constant theme. But most of my work has to do with engaging with contemporary questions and cultural challenges and so forth, drawing from the classical tradition, usually with a bit of a Neoplatonic slant. But I try to draw from the whole principally Western tradition.
Thank you, James.
So I'm James Matthew Wilson. I might be kind of an unusual interloper in this conversation. I'm a poet by habit and by profession, I guess, and I teach at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. I founded and run the Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing there. So most of my time is spent thinking about things like iams and trochees and rhymes, and not as much about the transcendentals directly, but anyone who's paid any attention to academia over the last 40 years has seen that literary education long since betrayed its commitment to literature as a way of knowing. And so as someone who had been moved by literature and wanted to understand why literature seemed to contribute to the wisdom of human life, I was sort of forced into starting to think philosophically and theologically in order to explain that to myself. And so over the years, I sort of worked my way into those intellectual traditions, and with great joy, because I suppose the great fruit was that I was as happy to read a dialogue of Plato as I am to read a poem by John Donne. And so the world just got broader and bigger by that mode of exploration.
It's John, if I may, it might be worth pointing out, James and I were colleagues both at the beginning of our career, just offices a couple doors down from each other. So we've had some very great conversations, but it's been a while now that we're in different parts of the country. So it's really exciting to be able to talk to James again too.
Yeah, it's precisely the case that The Vision of the Soul as a book was composed more or less coming out of casual conversations standing in the door jams of our offices. Yeah.
Yeah. Most of the university takes place in the hallways. Yes.
Yeah.
So, James, if I could start with you, because we're going to make your book sort of the central thing, because it's entitled about the topic we want to address here, and you link this. You spend the first chapter doing something which is kind of unique. I've read a lot of the scholarship, Platonic, Neoplatonic, the Romantics, the idealists, and phenomenology, and so forth. But you actually start with something which is interesting. I don't know if this is quite the right adjective given what you say in the first chapter, but the first chapter is kind of political in its orientation. Again, I'm hesitating in using that because you qualify that immensely in the first chapter, but you're making a case that for a kind of conservatism that really doesn't show up in the popular media as what is labeled a conservative. And to my understanding, you're saying conservatism, you make this really provocative claim, it's primarily a literary movement that is trying to conserve the Christian Platonic tradition. And that's a very provocative thing to say. I think it's really interesting. Could you unpack that for a little bit for us? Maybe that can get us going.
Yeah, sure. So it especially looking back on this book, it was begun 20 years ago, and so I'm looking back on it with 20 years hindsight. The book unfolds really as a kind of pilgrimage, as my journey towards an understanding of the Western tradition and the roots of it. And so it starts where I found myself, not where I necessarily would want to begin an argument in its ideal form. And so one of the opening salvos is to consider the way in which Edmund Burke, that great founding statesman and scholar of the conservative tradition in 18th century England, the way in which he is kind of a defining figure for a certain attitude towards the world. And that attitude towards the world has came over time to be associated with the term conservative, not as the label for a party, but for a particular disposition towards the real. But Burke was primarily a statesman, and though he waxed brilliantly, I mean, his rhetoric is as good as it gets in the 18th century, he didn't always have command of his faculties. And so one of the endeavors I took was to go through his famous reflections on the revolution in France, and to try to discern what from the background of his mind would justify the kinds of statements he was making in a very intensely political moment, which was in the aftermath of the French Revolution. And so the upshot of the argument with Burke is that, as T.S. Eliot would have put it, he's making an argument with failing equipment, but he's doing the best he can. And what is he trying to do? My argument is that he's trying to hold on to the great inheritance of the Christian Platonist tradition, of the deliverances of Athens and Jerusalem. Does he have the most satisfactory account of these things? By no means. Nobody in the 18th century had the most satisfactory account of these things. That was prohibited in that century. But he sets us on the path to re-engaging with a vision of being. And that vision is more fundamental to his argument than any contingent fact of the French Revolution. So that's the way into the book. But of course, the sooner we get away from practical politics and into that more fundamental vision, the better.
Excellent.
May I comment on that, or did you? I don't want to.
Either one of you speak up whenever
preempt.
you wish. Yeah.
I mean, there's an interesting. I noted it was interesting the way you put that, James, at the end, re-engaging with the question of being. There's this interesting. What you think of conservative is preserving, but in a way, it's recovering. Restoring, and that's going to have it's it's precisely a movement that arises in modernity, in the modern age, especially with the French Revolution. And so there's a kind of reaction to something at its origin, which would be very different from a kind of the original engagement with being that is then by Burke trying, something that you're trying to recover. And I think that's something interesting to hold in mind, the difference between, an originally traditional movement and a kind of restoration of a tradition in a modern context.
Well, and that's actually one of the realizations that gave birth to so much of what I was writing in the book. There's a moment that I mentioned in the first chapter, which is T.S. Eliot, the great poet and Christian humanist intellectual, addressing the London Conservative Union at a luncheon in the 1950s. And Eliot says something to the effect of, everyone would agree that conservatism is a product of the anguish of Edmund Burke's mind in response to the French Revolution, or something along those lines. At the time he's speaking, he's just read Russell Kirk's great book, The Conservative Mind, which really is a very important book that's worthy of the contemporary reader's attention. And so Russell Kirk has Eliot thinking about Burke, but this is also in the aftermath, long in the aftermath, but in the aftermath of Eliot's single most important achievement as a poet, which was his composition of 4 quartets. And 4 quartets was Eliot's effort to write in a 20th century English lyric medium what Dante had done in the Divine Comedy. And so he was trying to recover and to recapitulate the vision of an entire civilization. Really, he's trying to re-articulate the wisdom tradition that goes back both to the ancient West and East. And in that poem, there's both Indic thought and Platonic thought and Thomistic thought all circling together, not to mention a lot of Aristotle and Plato. And when Eliot wrote that poem, he wrote most of it during the Second World War, when he feared that Western civilization was on the brink of being snuffed out. And so it's in that spirit of Eliot's 4 quartets, by and large, that this book was undertaken. This sense of crisis precipitating recovery and re-engagement.
So that is very consonant with my work in a lot of ways. I consider myself a counter-modernist, and in that I think many of the structures of our cultural cognitive grammar that were given to us by all the revolutions, the Protestant Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, we have a certain set of dichotomies and orientations that are taken as sort of non-questionable. They get questioned when we get to postmodernity, but we can come back to that in a few minutes. But we have this idea that, right, there was the birth of, again, all these terms are somewhat controversial. The birth of secularism is this sort of prevalent idea. Now, there's a lot of ways in which that can be disputed, but let's just take it as a starting place for the discussion. So, and then part of what I've been arguing is as we lost this this heritage in those revolutions, we have fallen into what I call the meaning crisis. We've lost fundamental ways in which we are connected to reality, and that it is in fact a constitutive feature of meaning that it needs to be connected to what we reasonably apprehend as most real, while also affording us the most inner peace, which is not just a negative lack of conflict, but a positive fullness of being, and that's what we're seeking in meaning. That's what we're seeking in meaning, and so there's a sense in which it sounds like there is well, it's not that implicit, it's explicit in parts. There's a critique of that framework, and so let me of modernity. Let me a few things that I've talked about, and then see what you're saying, and then David, you can play with it, and we can just sort of roll around with it a bit. Um, so one of the thing, with Duns Scotus, the univocality of being, and here I think of William Desmond and how much we've lost with that. And then we get, Occam, and we get nominalism. I'm doing a lot of history really fast here, but right, and then we get the claim of a kind of Platonic revival in the scientific revolution, by the way, that mathematics is, unlike natural language, a language that actually connects to reality. And those two, that history of nominalism into mathematical reasoning, computation, Hobbes says it outright, by ratiocination, right? I mean computation. He says it literally, that computational model. And so we get what I call a propositional tyranny. We get the idea that all of cognition is, basically like what a computer does. It's the coherence of a set of propositions that I then assert to be true in some fashion, where the asserting, and think of the history of nominalism behind that, is playing a crucial role. And we get a hermeneutics of suspicion, right? Everything is a projection onto reality. And of course, we can see Kant coming along the road there. So that's one thing. And for me, what that does is that removes something that I think you keep making reference to, James, in your book, which is non-propositional kinds of knowing. And this has become a big issue, I think in a positive sense, in third wave Platonism. Gonzalez and Drew Hyland and Kirkland, and myself and other people emphasizing the non-propositional. And the noetic knowing, which is the center of your book, would be a primary example of that. So one element would be the loss of these other kinds of knowing, and it seems that your book is speaking to that. And then another one, which I've been doing a lot of work on more recently, especially in the conversations I've had with William Desmond, is that modernity rejects the vertical dichotomy of the supernatural and the natural. It's absurd. There's no possible communication, causation. I'm not here to justify those arguments. I'm merely stating them. This is what I take right about the postmodern critique, but it replaced that, right? It couldn't erase it, because that had a lot of functionality. It accounted for normativity. It gave us a way of talking about appearance and reality. And so that functionality had to resituate. And so what it gave us is a bunch of horizontal dualisms: the subjective, the objective, value, fact, meaning, measurement, theory, data, all of these. And of course, what postmodernity, both in the analytic and the continental tradition, have done, have basically said those horizontal dualisms are as absurd as any of the vertical ones you rejected. And I take that to be the grain of truth that I really like from postmodernism. I think there's problems in postmodernism. And so there's two things that come to my mind as the hallmarks of modernity. One is this propositional tyranny, and then the second is the surreptitious replacement of a vertical dualism with an equally difficult horizontal dualism that straitjackets us. For example, and this is Desmond's point, if you believe in the fact-value dichotomy as a real division in reality, then reality is valueless, and we merely subjectively project onto it, which is an illusion, because ultimately, objectively, we are just insignificant beings. And then you have nihilism. He calls it default atheism, but I think it's just as much default nihilism. So for me, those are two pivotal things. I wonder, sorry, that was a long preamble, but I'm trying to make a connection from my work into the book, which again, I want to recommend to everybody very strongly, as I've always recommended David's books as well. How does that land for you, James, as like things that modernity sort of saddled us with.
That's a great formulation. I think it's very helpful. The worst chapter in my book is the only one that talks about it in those terms, unfortunately. But it's on Dante. The chapter on Dante talks about the way in which the modern person will routinely toggle back and forth between a kind of Baconian or Hobbesian materialism and then a sort of post-Kantian spiritualism. And we do it willfully. That is to say, we do it as the will requires. For most things outside of us, we can afford to perform a kind of mechanistic reduction upon them because that makes them available for our use. Right. But we don't want to do that to ourselves. And so suddenly we have to toggle back and discover that, I'm me, or my value judgments or my willfulness has a particular value that's not fungible and not reducible to anything else. And so I entirely agree with the formulation. I think you do it better than I do it in that book. That's my least favorite chapter. I'm still sometimes I regret publishing it. But the thing I would refer to, and this is going back to an early chapter in the book, is this really little known Alabama philosopher from the World War II period, Iredell Jenkins. I know very little about him. I know there's a graduate lounge for him in the philosophy department at the University of Alabama, so he's not forgotten. But he published a book on aesthetics, and then he published this wonderful essay, The Postulate of an Impoverished Reality. And Jenkins' argument is that the supposedly radical modern distinctions, and this is gonna play right into the dualisms that you were just describing, between, say, the Cartesian rationalist idealism and Hobbesian or Lockean discursive empiricism, that these are not distinctions without a difference, but they're superficial compared to what all these early modern thinkers have in common. And that's the deliberate commitment to the presumption that reality is less complex than our experience of it. Mm-hmm. And this was a decision, I think, of the will. It's not an intellectual decision, first of all. It's a decision of the will to begin to make things available to itself for use. And that's why, I mean, there are so many ways in which I would make a pretty bad philosopher, but one of them is that I have a hobby horse that I can't seem to get over no matter how many times I write about it. And that's the opening passages of Aristotle's Metaphysics, the first 5 pages of the Metaphysics. What Aristotle does there is position the human person and the human mind in relationship to everything else that is. And relationship is the operative word here. That is to say, yes, the mind by its own nature stretches out towards knowing, he says at the beginning. But then just a few pages later, he retells that Genesis story of human thinking. The mind only stretches out towards knowing in wonder because the world first confronts the mind with the wonderful. Mm-hmm. So every human operation is a free response in relationship to what comes first. And it's no coincidence, I think, that Milton wrote Paradise Lost with the wonderful account of Satan denying his creation by God at the very end of this early modern period in European thought. Because what does Satan say? He's told by Abdiel, how can you betray the God who created you? And Satan says, oh, was I created now? I have no recollection of having been created. He wants to be his self-creator. He wants to be the first initiator of his own action. But we're just not that way. We are creatures who are inserted into being. And so our very first act, including our act of being itself, is a response, not a first initiative. And I think the modern age tried to clear all that away in order to allow the human person to be first in myriad different ways. But it's that fundamental act of willfulness to make ourselves first that sets everything unfolding over the next 500 years.
Yes, thanks. The phrase that comes to mind, John, you mentioned William Desmond, his notion of the passio essendi,
Yeah.
that our first act of being is a receptive one. This was a big theme also in my father's work from start to finish, his constant theme. But I'd like to connect that also just with the title of your book, James, the vision of the soul. I mean, there's a reference already there to the opening pages of Aristotle. It's interesting, John, your discussion of the move made in early modernity, this kind of reduction of the horizon of knowing to the propositional, as you put it, and then the calculative and so forth, and the various dualisms that are implied in that. It's interesting that um, another book that is well known but worth reading for anyone who hasn't, the Leisure, the Basis of Culture,
Oh yeah.
Joseph Pieper. He describes it. It's sort of just a nutshell encapsulation of this reduction. But I have found it just constantly illuminating the distinction between intellectus and ratio.
Mm.
Um, that ratio is the discursive act of the mind that's founded in propositions and so forth. Seeing how one thing relates to another. It's discursive in the etymological sense, running through from one thing to another. So an act of reason that shows us how things are connected. But in the classical view, that was always a secondary sort of thing. All motion is always for the sake of rest. It sort of begins in rest and ends in rest. And more fundamental than ratio is intellectus, and intellectus was understood not as reasoning, but as beholding what is true, simply seeing the vision of truth, you might say. And that there's if you think about it, what's going on in the vision like that, there is the soul is reaching out beyond itself to receive something that is genuinely other than itself. So there's a kind of a radical, there's a passio in that, a radical receptivity, response to what is other. And the way Aristotle presents that, I mean, he obviously he doesn't have these problems in mind, but begins by saying, all men by nature desire to know. And then he says, the evidence we have of this is the delight that we take in our senses. Delight, the word for delight, by the way, is agape, is the verb for agape. People don't normally notice that. And the delight in the senses is also what comes to be the classical definition of the experience of beauty.
Mhm.
That it seems to me that it's inseparable, this primacy of intellectus, and this notion that our first encounter with the world is an encounter with something that's beautiful, that calls us into itself. And there would be a million things to say about that, but I will stop there.
No, that's great. I think that's good. I'm going to hold it that I prefer the Greek noesis over intellectus, because people hear intellect, and then when they hear intellect, they hear intellectual, and that's back into the propositional possession of propositions. So I deliberately, I understand how you're using the terms. I'm just explaining why I prefer the Greek, because it doesn't carry with that same kind of association that people draw. So let's talk about.
One quick thing before, because that's a great observation there, John. Just one quick thing. I like that too. I like to use the nous and the logos as well, because
Yeah,
logos is a many
yeah,
it's a many-headed beast, and so it's hard to reduce logos just to logic or just any one thing, and so it suggests the way in which discursivity is always moving in different directions. Sorry, not always. It's always moving in one direction, back to nous, back to the fullness of vision, but it has multiple paths. There are multiple logoi. Okay.
excellent. Okay, so that's helpful. I did notice that, James, in your book, and I would flag it when you did it. I appreciated it, and I hope we do get time to talk about your close to culminating argument about the interpenetration of mythos and logos, which goes to the heart of a lot of the work I do. So there's and David knows more about this perhaps than you do, James, that you've seen some of my talks. There's a generation, a group of cognitive scientists, 4 ecog sci, who emphasize what Desmond would call the metaxu, this participatory relationship of indwelling the world and internalizing it and looping with it as actually constitutive of cognition. So we do not like the mind, the interior metaphor. The mind is not in the head. It is between the embodied person and the world. That's where we locate. It's a betweening. And a mutual shaping and participation is central. And then that participatory knowing makes possible perspectival knowing, which is what we're talking about here. And I want to get into this. We're using visual metaphor, and I want to push on that in a good way, not in a undermining way. See, because for ecog sci is born of this idea, and it bears it out, I think, with quite a bit of evidence, which is our sensory motor life, the way we orient and navigate and negotiate the sensory motor world, gets exapted. This is a term from evolutionary theory in which tongues were exapted for speech. They didn't originally evolve for speech. That's why many organisms have tongues, but they don't speak. But you can repurpose the tongue for speech. And what the brain does, when I say brain, I always mean brain in the body, in the environment, okay? What the brain does is it repurposes the sensory motor machinery, I don't like that term, but whatever, for, right, what we typically call more abstract cognition. And this shows up in the fact that we cannot help but gesture. And so we are doing sensory motor behavior in order to try and convey as a metaphor, right? Abstract thought. And our thought is filled with conceptual metaphor. This is the work of Lakoff and Johnson, and we're invoking it here. I hope you see what I say. I hope you grasp my point. I hope we're in touch with reality. We're using all of this. And the idea here is that there isn't a stark break between what you might have called in the Cartesian world the physical senses and the mental senses. I'm trying to use these terms as broadly as possible. That in fact there's a deep continuity between them. That the heights of your spirituality reach into the depths of your embodiment in a profound way. And here I'm influenced by Mark Wynne. James, you talk about how David talks about in the critique going back down into the cave because the good encompasses both the absolute and the relative. Brilliant point, by the way. A lot of Platonists need to hear that point, I would say. But Wynne then says, yeah, but phenomenologically, and this is the question I want to bring now, phenomenologically, what's it like after he's accommodated? Right, the person who's seen the sun, the sage, goes back and he's accommodated and he's now there and he can now do what David is doing, but not abstractly, right? But what's his phenomenology like? And Wynne does this fantastic thing in the book called The Renewing the Senses. He goes through James's passages of people going through metanoia, through religious conversion. And it's not that they have a focal object that they see, it's that it's adverbial. Their way of seeing everything changes. Everything changes in a fundamental way. And so I have a lot more to say, but I just wanted to get that out because I want to try and probe on the phenomenology of the vision of the soul. And here's where this is where I like a lot of what the new Platonists are doing, like John Rusin and William Desmond and Gonzalez, is that they're trying to restore, which I think is legitimate, by the way, the abstract language that Platonism has often drifted into, back into, yeah, but how does it show up in the guts? The guts of our actual phenomenological experience. And so to do a Thomas Nagel thing on it, what's it like to have the vision of the soul? What's that like? And why do we want to why do we feel bound to using sight? I think there's connections between that and insight and flow and other things, but I'll say what I have to say after I hear what you two, what's it like? What's the phenomenology of the vision of the soul? Because for me, right, I often tell people, don't tell me what you believe, tell me what you practice, right? And for me, I would want to know from your book, James, which is like, it's really provocative, and it's provoking me to, well, what practices would undertake? And if I'm trying to cultivate skills, I need phenomenological touchstones to tell me when I'm doing it well. What is it like when I am doing it well? And so sorry, that's a bit of another ramble, but I'm trying to pose a question to both of you. What's it like? What's it like? What's the phenomenology like? What are you trying to get at with these metaphors? And I'm not dismissing them because they're metaphors. I'm not doing that at all. I hope you understand that.
Mm-hmm. David, you go first.
I was worried you were going to say that. Yeah. Oh, that is such a fantastic question and proposal of an approach, and that's it's also it's sort of calling to account in a way that I think is really healthy for thinking, because it's very easy to have ideas sort of take on a life of their own and get increasingly detached from praxis in a way that you just won't notice if you're not deeply involved in it. So that's a very healthy move, and I would need more time to think about it. I'm giving James here a little couple minutes, but just to sort of take a first stab, I'm connecting it with this sense of the the transcendentals specifically, and if we think of the transcendentals not just as like particular objects of experience, but you might say sort of the formality of every object of experience. So a real insight, a proper insight into beauty, truth, and goodness. It's not just this one thing is beautiful or this one thing is good, but we see whatever it is that we see as in the light of beauty, truth, and goodness. So there's a particular way that it manifests itself against, you might say, against the background of an ultimate beauty, truth, and goodness. And so what exactly is that like? I think that there's this is probably where a poet is better than a philosopher, really, and maybe a cognitive scientist too. But to maybe begin, I mean, the one thing I think we could say is there's a sense of presence of things. Um, we all know what it's like. I mean, we've all had the experience of driving to someplace familiar, and you get there and you suddenly realize with a certain panic that you don't remember anything in the last 20 minutes. I mean, not a single thing that you passed, even though you were mechanically doing the right things. I mean, you didn't crash, as far as you know. But it's without any presence at all. So that would be the counter of this. We also have had the experience where things really light up for us, where we're sort of inspired. We usually requires a good night's sleep. I've noticed, and we find ourselves capable of genuinely a kind of attention is the word, attentiveness, and a responsiveness where the absolute uniqueness of a thing stands out and calls our attention to itself, and we find ourselves responding in a really spontaneous, natural way without having to overcome any sort of separation or alienation, but we're in tune with the world, and that's almost always going to be experienced, I think, fundamentally as a kind of joy and celebration. So these are just some first. I mean, there would be a lot more to say, but let me just start with that.
That's great, James.
It's almost hard. It's not hard to answer the question you pose. It's hard to answer it without repeating things that everyone's heard before, and though they still need to be said again. And that's David mentioning the word attention is a great one. That's a term that Simone Weil focuses on in her essays, and she's coming out of that romantic Christian Platonist tradition that in English to which we owe so much in Coleridge and Wordsworth. And one of the great insights of the Romantics was, for all of the, I think there are many problems and wayward theses that get bound up with their work, but But one of the things they recognize is the possibility of pure reception, of being simply awakened to the light. And so a few thoughts on that. The first one is, and this is kind of going back to your question earlier, I gave a nice, what I think of anyhow, is a nice critique of the modern age as trying to make us the human psyche, the first initiative in reality rather than receptive. But really, it's important to note that if you're talking about intellectus nous, or the vision of the soul, the modern age, and indeed the perennial human temptation, is actually to snuff out the lights on either end of human reality, to pretend that we're not initially receptive, and that therefore only a sort of rationalizing discursive gait of studying things gets us moving toward reality, but then also the desire to snuff out the light at the end, the denial that the cumulating climactic moment of any human initiative is finally to rest in the fullness of act of that. Both of those things get snuffed out. And so you have Cartesian rationalism at the beginning, but you also have, to go back to Pieper's Leisure, the Basis of Culture, the invention of the intellectual worker, the knowledge worker in the sort of Kant and then post-Kantian thought that proposes that each discursive proposition is a hard-won nugget of the real, and once we have it, we have to just move on to the next one and be in perpetual state of acquisition. So if we take that kind of abstractly conceived, what are the practical things we do? The first thing, and this is where the romantics, I think, are at their best, is we stop and see the light, receive the vision of just not some particular thing, but of things as such. And the best example of this that I can think of is in my second favorite movie of all time, which is John Ford's The Quiet Man, where John Wayne has returned to his native Ireland, to the small town in the west of Ireland. He's riding in the buggy with Micheline O'Flynn, the leprechaun character in the film. And they're riding in this little horse and buggy across a stream. And then suddenly he looks out to his right, and coming down the hillside is a flock of sheep. And then in blue, white, and red, the red-headed Maureen O'Hara, to which John Wayne responds, not what's her name, is she married, how old is she? He says to Micheline O'Flynn, is that real? That to recognize that that's actually where things begin for us is the first start, and that requires cultivating a conception of attention, where you receive, and this is Pieper's emphasis. Pieper's account of Intellectus is not, I don't think, quite perfect, but one good thing about it is he captures at least that initial receptivity of the mind to what's given to us. But then on the other end, the culminating moment of everything in light and attention is expressed in all the modes of the contemplative life, with the first one being the contemplation of the divine light of God in itself and unfiltered. But since we don't have access to that here, we have to do different parodies of it, including monastic prayer, contemplation, the silencing of the soul. But also, I've been giving lectures the last couple of years on what I call the 5 arts, and it's using the word art pretty loosely, but it's to recognize that all of the arts in which human beings engage, from the useful or the common arts, as some people call them, through the fine arts, the liberal arts, the liturgical arts, and then finally the contemplative arts, that these are all activities that anticipate our final state of contemplation. And so even in the useful arts, even in the work of the manufacturer, the wood carver, the mechanic, rediscovering the contemplative dimension in those humble everyday activities that we tend to think of as somewhat thoughtless, but in fact are properly human and do entail a contemplative state of mind, a contemplative activity for the human person, if they're to be done well. I'll end with just saying this. This is what I think is one of the great insights of the early encyclical letter of John Paul II, Laborum Exercens, where he tries to recover a sense of work, and he calls it the subjective dimension of work, that work is for man, not for the thing made. And what he's describing there is that interior to the most practical human activities is an inbuilt contemplative dimension that's properly human, and that is itself humanizing. So recovering a just concept of work is entailed in all of this.
James, that seems to speak towards the continuity that I was talking about earlier, between sort of our most ecstatic, lofty, contemplative states and our engagement with, the wood we happen to be carving, or the martial artist, the move they happen to be making. And so I want to explore something with you then, with both of you. Um, so Noesis is, etymologically is connected with attention and noticing, and both of you have brought that out. What's perspectival knowing? What's it like to be me here now, oriented this way, sizing things up the way I do? And it seems to me then that what we're talking about, this light and they're shining, and Wynne makes this explicit. He talks about hue, which just is a sense of realness, but the thing he talks a lot about that really perked up my ears was salience. I do a lot of work on salience, and salience is really interesting because salience is both that presencing of things, them standing out and calling for us to uniquely attend to them, right? That's what a sudden noise. You turn, right, and you orient. What is different? What is new here? What is unique here? That's what's going on. And salience is it's experienced as shining. Things shine when they're salient to us, and attention, of course. What's interesting is attention is both called by salience. If I make something salient to you, you will direct your attention to it. But your attention also renders things salient. If I say your left big toe, it is now salient to you in a way it wasn't, hopefully, a couple minutes ago. And so you've got this going forth and coming back of attention, and this is salience. And the reason I'm bringing this up is, and here's my shameless self-promotional plug. I just got a paper published in Philosophical Psychology proposing a continuum from fluency to mystical experience, which is basically, we have these basic experiences where things are salient to us in a way that is fluent to us. We know it's obvious to what we should do. It's obvious what sense we should make out of that. But when we get a spike in that kind of fluency, we get an insight, that aha moment, which sounds a lot like what both of you are talking about, where we suddenly go, it's not just that we're attending, we were somehow thwarted, and because we were not properly conformed to the thing, and we are willing to undergo some kind of transformation. Restructuring is the psychological term, such that we now can see into the thing. And then when you and this is right, this goes to some of my earlier work, David, I think I've mentioned this to you. When you get a bunch of insights cascading together because you're set in an environment that requires you to cascade, where one insight primes another, like rock climbing or martial arts or poetry or jazz, people get into the flow state. Now, the flow state already starts to have some of the features you're talking about. And the thing about the flow state, it is universal. It is a genuine universal, which is rare in the social sciences. People across age groups, genders, like language use, socioeconomic status, political orientation, the things that normally radically divide us. People describe having this experience, and they describe it in detail using almost synonymous terms. So it's a powerful universal. In the flow state, this is when the demand, and think about what you said, James, about those two motions. The world first confronts us, and then we also are drawn to it, right? The demands of the situation can just be reached if your skills are supplemented with insight. So I'm a martial artist. I'll get into the flow state if I'm sparring with somebody, and I can't just bring all my skills. I have to innovate. I have to improvise. I have to bring insight moment by moment into the practice. And what happens in that state is you get a radical sense of at-one-ment. You get a loss of egocentrism. You get a sense of radical connectedness. And people report it's like the world is like if the world was a TV, the brightness and the contrast have been turned up. The world is super salient, and there's an ongoing sense of a discovery that is largely ineffable to them. And then the proposal goes on in the paper to say, yeah, but when we're not flowing in a particular domain, like martial art or poetry or jazz, but when we're flowing in the fundamental ways in which we orient and identify with being, then we can get a mystical experience. And so the idea is there's a continuum here of how we are, right, exacting salience in order to reach more and more deeply into the world. And this seems to be naturally rewarding to us, which sounds like a lot of what both of you have been talking about. And I just wanted to put that out as a proposal. And does it, because I'm trying to make connections between what you're talking about, this vision, this noetic vision, and the continuity that we sort of brought up, and how that might actually land in more, again, specific phenomena for which we have some understanding of the existing phenomenology. And I should, to make the connection even clearer, that mindfulness is predictive of insight and getting into the flow state. And of course, mindfulness practices also bring about mystical experiences. So that's a proposal I want.
So, David, do you want to rush in?
No, go ahead. I'll
Because
let you go first this time.
Because the thing that one of the sort of errors of intellectual history that really became most conspicuous in the late 19th century. We get some of it in William James, but also in Evelyn Underhill's book Mystics, is the sense of the mystical as really a kind of esoteric reinterpretation of Cartesian detachment, of it leaving the world behind. But what you're describing is a much more complex and ubiquitous phenomenon that is in fact showing, to use a term from Charles Taylor, that's showing a porousness, which you were describing earlier, the mind as really being extended and not in, but out of us. That, as Aquinas would put it, the form is the soul is the form of the body. So your body is really in your soul, not the other way around. Which
well said. Well said.
That's not a small sort of just nice observation from Aquinas. I think it's really fundamental that all kinds of realism have to actually finally converge with Aquinas on that particular understanding of the relationship of form and matter. Which, this is the main point I wanted to make. Aquinas' source there is initially Aristotle, and early in the physics, I think this gets repeated in the metaphysics, but it's in the second book of the physics where that I'm thinking of right now, where Aristotle first introduces the concept of form. He doesn't define form, he describes it by cataloging it, listing it off. Form is a shape, it's essence. Who knows the particular? I don't remember off the top of my head the particular names he uses, but it's just it's a laundry list of terms to get at the formness of the form. What's really insightful there, and there's many things, but one of them is that form for Aristotle is first and most obviously shape. It's the way of an appearance, but also it's the interior reality, the causal principle of a thing, the active principle of a thing. And to not just certain kinds of Platonists, but people like Jacques Maritain, whom I admire greatly, tend to get this part wrong. So if Maritain, in his great book Art and Scholasticism, refers to form as the ontological secret, well, it's not a secret. It's a mystery, but it's not a secret. The reason it's a mystery is because we can tell that the formedness of appearances is not just an appearance. It's always giving forth or bestowing or disclosing interior realities, and vice versa. Interior realities are always refocusing and bringing to light the nature of appearances. And so there's this continuous um,
Mm,
dialectical movement back and forth from the
mm,
interior to the exterior. I mean, again, we don't have to even accept these terms. That's just the convenient one to use. Um, but you know, just to put a fine bow on it, with this wonderful moment in the symposium uh, early on, where Socrates is, going to Agathon's house, but he gets left behind because he's sort of pulled over into a threshold and is thinking about something.
yeah.
And Aristodemus has to continue on, etc. Well, one of the things that's revealing to us is the kind of interiority of the intellectual life, that it sometimes shuts off the body, that we just shut down and go into ourselves, and that's a sign of of the non-material dependence of the intellect in its proper act. But there's a it's a popular tradition rather than a scholarly tradition of thinking of Plato as emphasizing that the ascent of the mind to the forms, to the good, is a literal leaving of the world, is a setting by, laying by of the world as such. But in fact, what it was being described in the Symposium, the Phaedrus, and the Republic is an imminent movement of the mind going to the unconditioned and back to the conditioned, and well, from the unconditioned to the from the conditioned up to the unconditioned, and then back to the conditioned, and it's doing that all at once. This is just what it is to think. It's not a particular mystical pathway away from the world.
No.
It's rather how we enter into the world. So I really appreciate the language of insight as just one of these. It's basically a quotidian activity um, that transcends the world, but is also a way of being more properly in it.
If I could,
Of
yeah,
course.
just add a few points to that, which is just beautifully said. I mean, both of you, but really, really fascinating. The uh, there's an interesting connection between intelligence and the hand. I mean, you both mentioned that this is embodied, and James, you were talking about how um, even useful arts can be a form of contemplation. And I think it's really important to understand that properly. I mean, as people listen to you, they might think, well, I contemplate while I'm working with my hands, and of course that's not false, and that's something that we can do, but I think it's much more interesting and more true to the reality to think of our hands are we actually know with our hands in the very um, a kind of contemplative activity. There's something about taking something apart and fiddling with it. You're actually contemplating it bodily there, as much with your mind as with your hands, and that notion that our bodily life is itself as for human beings, the body itself contemplates. I think that's an absolutely crucial thing to recover, and it's something we experience in these flow states that you're talking about, John.
Mhm.
Um, Aquinas gives us there's a whole lot in Aquinas to reinforce this. I mean, you mentioned his sort of side comment that he makes about the body being in the soul rather than the soul in the body, which is so crucial. It's another dimension of his thought that I think is really important here is his recognition that um, the intellectual principle of the soul, so its highest, most sort of spiritual function, that is the form of the body.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a temptation to think that we have a mind and then we have a body, and somehow these have to fit together. Um, the Thomistic insight is that that by which we contemplate God in our most ecstatic states is also the principle of our digestion and locomotion and sexual life and so forth. All of these things, it's the same principle. There's a unity there, and one of the expressions of the unity is that when James, you were talking about Socrates when he sort of struck he's sort of paralyzed with contemplation in a way. I mean, and we need to read that properly. He's not paralyzed. We can think of this as leaving the body behind, but it's really taking up the whole body into a kind of an ecstasis that when we see it in those terms, we see that the body is involved in the ecstasis. It's almost like, you know, with the flow state that John was describing in martial arts. I mean, it's almost like that person's body that I'm wrestling with is part of the body within which my mind is dwelling. So, I mean, that it's so far sort of that's part of the very agency by which I'm thinking. So it actually is quite concrete, and I think that these Thomists don't often draw these implications, but I think that they are implied by Thomistic principles.
That's David, you're reminding me. I've given a lecture a couple times. I haven't published it, but it's I just decided to go through classical texts and gather up a bunch of quotations about philosophical claims about the human body, and they fall broadly into three categories: the eye, the ears, the posture, and the hands.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's not the proper order. I think it really should be hands and then the posture. But we've already talked about this vision that the brilliance of the eye is that. Well, let me start over real quickly. The brilliance of the eye is that it's not the nose.
Mm-hmm.
When we smell things, we feel as if the world is invading us, and not always in a pleasant manner. But when we see with the eye, we experience the manner in which a certain kind of distance actually allows something to be made present.
Mm-hmm.
We go out of ourselves into the world by the eye, but only because the world itself first shines its light upon the eye. And so the eye is this great literal medium that describes what the true nature of human sight is. Because what the eye does with physical light, the mind does with the spiritual light, with the light of the intellect. And I could go in with the other parts of the body, but I think just this classical sense of always thinking from and with the body, there's so much of that in antiquity, and it's not dated or merely cute. It's actually, I think, very insightful.
Well, it's coming to prominence now. Well, I want to pick up on that, James, and also David, what you said, because I mean, we're talking about, I like to use the term realization, which is a term we often use for insight, but it carries with it a double meaning, both the insight aspect and the disclosing of realness to us. So when we want to think of an insight as a kind of epistemic achievement, and I say, I realized, so I have an insight and it actually disclosed an important aspect of reality to me. And here's the thing, and David knows that this is bound up with all the work I do on relevance realization, and I'm not going to go into that right now. But along those lines, it seems to me that, I want to propose that we not only have a continuum of sight, we have an exaptive continuum of hearing and of touch and of orientation. I think that's what posture is trying to pick up on, our kinesthetic proprioceptive sense of how we're oriented. Because I've been noting that all of these are showing up in various ways. And one of my concerns, I mean, I've got Rorty right here. I'll just be honest, right? He's right here, right? The philosophy in the mirror of nature and the ocular metaphor and blah, 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 right? I don't know why he's above my left like that. But anyways, and you have criticisms of, and I think these are better criticisms than Rorty. I think this is where Rorty's bite actually lands, although I don't, is this idea, Toads in his work on the body and others say, like, and Hume really typifies this. If you have a spectator notion of perception, that what I'm doing is just passively spectating, right? Then causation disappears. Because if I'm not moving around and hearing and touching things, I lose the way all of the senses correct and call to each other in a powerful way. And so hearing seems to be on a, I mean, Smith in his really good book Appeal and Attitude talks about this. We find things appealing, right? That's another way in which they shine to us. And appeal means to call, right? And things call to us. And this goes towards, notions around voluntary necessity. For example, John Searle, when I get to the conclusion of a really good argument, the conclusion calls to me. I'm not it's not compulsive like an addiction or a reflex. I can choose not to believe, but there's something calling to me. And he, all right, and Frankfurt talks about this. Love is a voluntary necessity. I feel bound to sorrow, but I don't feel like I'm losing my agency. Just like I feel bound to the conclusion, but I don't feel like I'm losing my agency when I come to that conclusion. This sense of being called, and of course, this is all through the Bible. In fact, calling metaphors are as prevalent, if not more, than beholding metaphors in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, but even in the New Testament, calling, right? So hearing and calling seem to be also important ways in which we get into this deeper relation of realization. And then, of course, touch. And here's the work of Kearney and other people. Touch has this unique property that it discloses something that all the senses have, but is often implicit. And James, you've pointed to it. Into what the obvious point that whenever I touch, I'm being touched. Whenever I touch, I'm being touched. And so whenever I'm realizing, I'm being realized. And touch is the reminder. And this is why we use touch when we want to talk about sanity and contact with reality. I just did it. Are you in contact with reality? Get a grip on yourself. You're losing touch with things. And so it seems to me that although the visual metaphor is prevalent, but Plato does replace
It's often said, yeah, that the Greeks emphasized the visual and the Hebrews the oral, the hearing, and there's something to be said for that, which is why, yeah,
and the Taoists emphasize touch.
that's interesting. Yeah.
Right. And so I don't think either one of you are like dogmatic exclusivists. So does the noetic vision, should it actually, because Wynne actually explores this again in Renewing the Senses, it's not just vision. All of these, and this is an ancient tradition. I mean, of course, I'll have to mention somebody who's officially got not good standing, which is Origen. He's got this notion of the spiritual senses that develop out of all of the physical senses, and that a proper part of the Christian life is the awakening and the enlivening, the living through of the spiritual senses. And I want to put it to you: is it the case? Would you consider that it's not just that there's a noetic vision? There's also I'm sorry, sounds a bit oxymoronic if you know the Greek, but a noetic hearing, a noetic touch that we should be including when we're talking about this, especially if we're saying the whole body is properly involved in this process.
Yeah, if I mean, I think, and smelling and tasting as well. I mean, the thing is, I think every single sense has something unique. One could do a metaphysics of the senses. I think that would be a profoundly interesting book. David Bentley Hart has a reflection on smelling in his novel about the dog, Rolling by Moonlight. The dog is complaining that the dog talks in the book and is the wise man actually, and is complaining about how humans don't take smelling seriously enough. But there's something about, you sniff something out. What does that mean? There's something about your eyes can deceive you, but your nose won't. Is that you can when you try to figure out if the milk is spoiled, you can look at the date, but you finally just have to smell it and you can tell, right? There's something about disclosing something. And then taste, of course, I mean, there's a long tradition about
taste and see that the Lord is
taste
good.
It's at the root of the word for wisdom. Sapere sapientia. And it's interesting that it's also related to the word for sap, or the word sap. the kind of
I didn't know that. Yeah.
interior juice of something,
Yeah. Right. Right.
that you taste it, you savor it in your mouth, and that's a if we lose the sense of taste in that
Good.
profound
Good.
way, we're going to lose a kind of contemplative sense of knowing.
This is actually, I think, the reason for the central claim about human beings and the relationship to the cosmos that begins in Plato and Aristotle, but then continues in Augustine, Dionysius, and beyond. And it's the centralization of eros as the movement of the will. Because eros has its immediate connotations of touch. And in the Phaedrus, in the Palinode, is playing with the idea of sexual arousal, which is touch, uh, as part of the winged descent of the soul. And with Saint Augustine, it's with his particular channeling of the Psalms into so much of his writings. The emphasis of eros is on the fullness of the presence of physical communion as the adequate figure for what it means to be fully present, fully in communion with the Spirit or God or with anything whatsoever. And so eros becomes the term that conveys that, because eros is lofty. It comes to speak about our ascent to what is absolute, but it's a word that has already been rolled around in in the mud of the body before it comes to be used in that way. And that's why it comes to be used that way, because that's the word that conveys the full physicality of intellectual communion, the full physicality of it, meaning that it involves the whole person, not just the soul, not just some isolated part of the soul that's coming in connection with one of your glands, according to Descartes.
That's one of the things that's so striking in Plato's sense of beauty. Why there's a connection specifically between eros and beauty. And beauty, why does it send tremors? I mean, it's really striking and something worth reflecting on. I mean, we tend to dismiss it as just a metaphor or whatever, but his description is that beauty is the one intelligible form that the body can sense, that we actually have a bodily experience of an intelligible reality. And so that bridging of what seemed to be in insuperable chasm between the two realms, that bridging is precisely what provokes this trembling, this earthquake, in the soul. And it's interesting for that very reason. It's precisely eros that gathers the whole person up, body and soul, as you were saying, James. And that's precisely then. I mean, I think we miss this point in Plato so often. We think of him as separating the soul and body so in such a facile way, but it's only in that ecstatic, that sort of body soul ecstasy, that you can actually perceive the forms in the Platonic sense, which is, I mean, it's a very different paradigm, I think.
This is what got me started on everything, and that led to the vision of the soul. And actually, I wanted to restate some of the argument there, David, because I can't remember if we agree on this or disagree on this. It's been too long since I read the Catholicity of the Catholicity of Reason, but I know that you have the chapter in there, the ordering of the Transcendentals.
You've probably read it more recently than I have, so
I've read it a couple times, so but it's still not coming back to me fully. But see if you can jog your memory. But I know my argument is that first disclosure of the wonderfulness of being that awakens the mind in response and sends it out towards knowing, that is the encounter with beauty. That beauty as a property of being is this first capacity of being to give itself away. It's being self-gift to other being. And so there's a primacy of beauty in that respect, because this is why it's so important that John Wayne says, is that real, when he sees Marina Hera? He's not asking, what is her essence? Let me abstract her hair. He's asking about this phenomenon itself that is first given, and he's receiving it at that fundamental level before the intellect can begin with broader concerns about its truth or its goodness, which come in good, very quickly thereafter. But then that beauty is first. Beauty comes first. It's the first way in which being discloses itself. But then there's also an ultimacy to beauty that we find best expressed, or at least most conveniently expressed, when I'm working with my graduate students in Thomas Aquinas, because in the account of the human good in Summa Contra Gentiles, he tells us the knowledge of God is the end of the human person, but then he does a deductive analysis of the different kinds of knowing until he shows that only a contemplative knowledge of God could properly be our happiness. A mere knowledge of certain facts about God's being will not suffice. Even the hearing of faith will be insufficient. Only this contemplative knowledge. But then elsewhere, not in that, but I think not in the Contra Gentiles, but in the maybe the Segunda. I just have to go look up the passage. But he says the contemplative life is the beautiful life par excellence. And what he's proposing there is that to refer to our ultimacy, our end, in terms of being our good, being a knowledge of the truth, well, that's all true, but it's only that supra good, supra true radiance of being that will finally allow us not simply to acquire and know the truth and move on, to acquire and know and receive a good and move on, or consume a good and move on, but rather to abide in it permanently. It's only beauty that makes that possible. And my broader argument is that this is just ubiquitous in the ancient texts, that the movement between Calon and Agathon, between good and beauty, is well known and continuous, but that beauty is always the ultimate criterion, so that the final answer to every question, why should I do X? The final answer will always be for the beauty of it. And it's because only the radiance of beauty can justify can be the final justification of even the pursuit of truth and goodness for us. I had another thing about the hand I wanted to go back to from Dave, but I think I'll just leave it with that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it seems to me that with the transcendentals, and this is when I talk about primacy, what is it? The primacy, centrality, and ultimacy. I mean, that's in a way it's part of a kind of a phenomenology. But I mentioned the footnotes, and this is something I've been developing in my own thinking. I mean, I think it's when you're talking about the transcendentals that are the fundamental properties of reality or traits of reality, you can order them in various ways. And I think an argument could be made that beauty is first. An argument could be made that it's what links together the true and the good. I just was on a committee of a dissertation of a fellow in England who made an outstanding argument for that point. And then I think that one can make an argument that it's last, but I think you could do that actually in a certain sense. Well, beauty I think is unique among the transcendentals, and what Plato actually says in one place, that something that is properly ultimate is also going to be first, and also going to be the link, the medium that links things. And I think that's how these things sort of work out. But the ultimate contemplative act, I mean, you wouldn't want to say that that's not truth, right? I mean, you would want to say, in a way, it's the fullness of what truth is, right? Or a recognition of something that is good in itself. That's not, you're not sort of leaving the good into the beautiful, but that's another way of talking about the goodness. So I think that the transcendentals, when you reach the highest peak, as it were, they're quite porous, to use the Desmondian term again.
One small point on that, I know there's other things we have to talk about, but I've really come to appreciate in the symposium the rough and ready way in which Plato associates the true, the good, and the beautiful. That he just mentions them always being together. I think there's 3 points in the symposium. They're always together. They're in the same paragraph. They're in the same speech, but he doesn't do anything to clarify their relationship. Just as, he says that love and beauty belong together because it's at beauty's birth that, that oh gosh, I'm forgetting the passage now, but you know what I mean. That
Right.
he puts them together, but he doesn't systematize it. And I think it's because there's this kind of circumcision, this what does von Balthasar say, that the dancing about truth and goodness in uncontained splendor. And even Maritain says, getting out way over his skis, if you're talking about Aquinas, he says that in a footnote, in truth, beauty is the radiance of all the transcendentals combined. And so you have beauty that is a transcendental, so it's a species within the genus, but then it's also the genus of all the species. And so it's just this, that could be incoherence, but I think actually it's just disclosing.
No, and I think it's really crucial that we allow all of those. I mean, that we don't try to narrow it down. I think that's really crucial, actually.
So I have, I guess, 2 points. I think they're related. The first is is an issue around transcendence. We've got sort of ascent going on, and other movements happening. Verticality is being invoked, and part of what I think also needs to be recovered is a different sense of transcendence. And this comes out of Murdoch and Wright, and because we're saddled with a notion of transcendence from modernity, which is the view from nowhere, which is the definition, the defining image that I think makes no sense, by the way, because the view from nowhere is the view of everything, everywhere, all at once, which is logically. Well, and not only that, it's logically impossible, Gödel, it's physically impossible, Einstein, and it's epistemically impossible, Heisenberg, right? So modernity has actually given birth to the math and the science that has completely undermined that vision and showed it in all the way that we think things can be impossible. It's impossible. And so if we bind transcendence to that notion of the view from nowhere, then I think we're doomed. And I think we're doomed into a kind of self-destructive cul-de-sac that modernity has burdened us with. Now, Wright proposes an alternative, and you'll see where I'm going in a sec, following on Murdoch, and Murdoch's famous example of the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law. And Wright talks about this as not the view from nowhere. This is the point of the essay. He calls this his sensibility transcendence. So the mother-in-law thought, the daughter-in-law was coarse and rude. And then she comes to realize that maybe she's like really authentic and sincere and spontaneous rather than impulsive. But the insight doesn't just go this way. She also realizes that she has an insight into the way she has been framing things in general. And she realizes that she has to give up an identification with a way in which she understood how she was framing reality. She's basically, right, there's a bidirectional insight. I call this reciprocal opening, right? You're opening up to the person, and then they open you up, and I think this is very much in line with the Platonic anagoge, by the way. I think that's how Plato describes it, as reciprocal opening, which is the exact opposite of addiction, by the way. Addiction is a kind of reciprocal narrowing. That's Mark Lewis's work. So if we got this idea of reciprocal opening and sensibility transcendence, and that's the thing, it's a sensibility transcendence. And it seems to me that reciprocal opening, right, carries with it a lot of what Wynne is talking about in the renewal of the senses. It's not that I'm seeing new things, and this is what he argues. It's that my seeing is much more insightful. My hearing is much more vocational. My touch is much more intimate. My taste is much more savoring, to pick up your point, David. And this is opening not only the world up to me, but making me realize how closed I have been to the world. And I'm not getting to some view from nowhere. I'm reciprocally opening in this participatory loop. And I wanted to know if that also lands, because I think if we are going to try and recover this this noetic, right, vision and hearing and touching and tasting, right, and seeing, right, um, we also need to recover a different sense of transcendence that the isn't the movement. I think it's a performative contradiction, as I just argued. The picture in a Wittgensteinian sense that held us in a grip, that defined objectivity. Objectivity is the movement to the view from nowhere, and I think that has collapsed. But I'm proposing that we could have a notion of transcendence that we could recover that seems to fit well with the Platonic anagoge and with this sensibility transcendence that we've been talking about throughout. I want to make that as a proposal.
You're reminding me of something I've been mulling lately, which is so my there are a few moments where I really fell in love with the philosophical tradition. One of them, I'll just say, since we have David here, was reading Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, which he had just published when I first joined him at Villanova. And so, I remember, John, years ago hearing you recommend that book and thinking, at last, it's getting the recognition it deserves. So, but another one early on was reading MacIntyre's After Virtue, and of course, discovering the joys of reading MacIntyre, which have finally, or actually after 30 years, are starting to wear off, I'm sorry to say. But the philosopher who's kind of come alive to me for the first time, whom I didn't appreciate when I was younger as much, at least, is Charles Taylor. And the reason, I mean, those two go together in their own way. And I got to speak with both of them together many years ago. But if there's one insight that we would associate those two individually with, I think it would be this: that for Taylor, the great insight, and it's in the second, I think, major section of Sources of the Self, is the way he redescribes the intellectualism, the realism of the classical tradition in such a way as if to make it seem plausible that it could have unfolded in some other way. We didn't have to put the nous at the center of our being, at least hypothetically. We could have philosophized in other ways, but the sense of the intellect as orienting the person to the real, and the self-mastery of the intellect governing the will, and the will governing the bodily passions, that hierarchical understanding of the person, again, the way Taylor narrates intellectual history, it could have shaken out differently, but this is the way it happened. So from that perspective, in our tradition is a real commitment to that particular kind of transcendence. That is, it's the mind that has access to communion with being, and therefore, in one sense, there is a view from nowhere, because the mind can know anything that is. It can know being. But then MacIntyre's great insight is that all rationality is tradition dependent, and that in fact, the language in which you think is bequeathed to you by a tradition, and so there's no thinking outside of a tradition, though you might hop across traditions in different kinds of ways that are very chancy and contingent, and by no means ever indicates that you've transcended either of the traditions you might be hopping across. And I think those two insights from them are really actually have to be held together. That reason is tradition dependent, but the mind that's reasoning is also always oriented to what is unconditioned, what transcends absolutely. And it's just a little bit difficult to be a human being, because you have to have both of those two things. You have to take things into account.
I always tell my students that human beings, we're both mystics and hobbits, and we are mystics because we're hobbits, and hobbits because we're mystics. And actually, in terms of the MacIntyre is enlightening in so many ways, but there's something about that, the way he characterizes the tradition dependence, that irks me a little bit. And this is, and it would be this, that the idea that we're sort of trapped by our tradition. I mean, I'm exaggerating. He doesn't use that language, but dependent in the sense of, if we were not connected to the tradition, we would we would have a sense of unconditioned being. And so these things are kind of in tension with each other, and we have to kind of balance them out or something like that. Now, this is a gross oversimplification of what he actually says, but there's a tendency there. It seems to me you want to get at it a slightly different way, which is, think about reason not being as tradition dependent, but as tradition liberated. you know that being rooted in a tradition, the more, so it's not the case that the more fully you're in a tradition, the more particular and less universal you are, so that you need to escape the tradition somehow. But quite the contrary. The traditions, the tradition. That's actually I think an argument could be made for the tradition that includes the whole of the human race. This is an argument that Pieper makes, and it's very appealing to me. But I'm still sort of thinking it through. But let me just bracket that. In any event, a tradition brings you, the more fully you enter into the particularity of a genuine human tradition, the more universal your insights become, which is one of the reasons why I think traditions can speak to each other. And that leads me to another point, which I think is, I mean, in a way, this is changing topics a bit, or it might, and I just want to put this on the table. But one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in the last year or two is, and this is something you have to be careful saying because people misunderstand it so much. But I've sort of rediscovered, or discovered for myself in any event, the significance of the heart, and the language of the heart, and to think of the heart, rather than thinking of the point of transcendence in the person is the mind simply, although I think that's true, but that the most fundamental point of transcendence is the heart. Now, the problem is we sentimentalize that. We think of it as the seat of emotions, or we think of it as just this blood pumping machine. But if you think of the heart is actually the place where soul and body really intersect. I mean, it's it's where Hobbit and mystic come together, right? It's where the spiritual dimension of human existence and the actual flesh and blood material dimension of existence come together. To think of that as a place where you most fully transcend yourself towards the other is actually in this very concrete realm of the heart. There would be a lot to be said about that, but I wonder what you two think of that language. Is this something that do you ever use that language of the heart?
Yeah,
Or is
I would, but again, if first of all, I want to preface it by saying I don't hold love to be an emotion.
yeah,
Love is a orientation and a way of participating in reality that can trigger various emotions. I love Sarah, and that can make me angry when someone threatens her, can make me sad when she's away. So love is, I mean, this is not really that controversial in the philosophy of emotion. Love isn't an emotion. And then if you think about it as not an emotion, but as much more, the place from which we fundamentally orient and identify and participate. Then I quote Murdoch, who I was talking about with sensibility transcendence. Love is the painful recognition that something other than yourself is real. And that's what I was trying to get at, David, with the sensibility transcendence. We're not some sort of going up to this, view from nowhere, which I reject. I'm just gonna, I'll be honest. I reject that view because I don't think it makes any sense at all. But the sense that I can experience a profound transcendence, for example, in my love for Sarah, that's a sensibility transcendence. All my senses are awakened and enlivened, and I don't mean anything like, I'm not trying to be graphic here, but all my senses are awakened and enlivened towards her, so that I indwell her and she indwells me in an ever increasing fashion. It's ongoing, accelerating, mutual conformity, and that's what I was trying to get at as a notion of transcendence, rather than the modern project, which I think is a project of trying to get absolute certainty and control. Is I am going to be above, I'm going to be the view from nowhere, which gives me And that's why I'm critical of it. So I definitely think about it that way. And I think of anagoge, and Plato does too. I think of it as a properly erotic act, as not just, you talk about this, you talk about the interwoven ecstasis of love and reason in your work.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and Aquinas directly says that in love you penetrate into the heart of the other and take the other wholly into your heart. He uses the language of
Exactly.
the heart.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've just found it. I've always shied away, not always, but I've tended to keep at a certain distance the language of the heart because it just seems so sentimental, trivial. But I'm increasingly convinced of the importance of it.
You've made a connection for me. Sorry, James, I'll give you a sec. But my question about recovering transcendence, I put it to you that my question about recovering transcendence and your project of recovering the heart are interwoven
Yeah,
projects.
absolutely.
That's
Yep.
what I'm
Yep.
putting to you.
Yeah. 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 That's why I suggested it. Just sounds like it's kind of
Yeah,
in line with what you're saying. It's kind of an interesting convergence.
I think so.
So I tried to, like the Tin Man, I tried to get a heart a few years ago. I read uh, uh, Dietrich von Hildebrand's book on the heart,
Yeah.
and I just couldn't.
Yeah.
It
No.
just it didn't work for me. I did it's but I so I'll say two things. One,
Yeah.
speaking of no view from nowhere, as I said at the outset, I come to all of this from the perspective of a practicing poet, and so one of my concerns, this is where romanticism I think went wrong, is the way in which it tries to root the insights of attention merely in an affective union.
Oh yeah.
And so I'm very wary of that, and so like a good Platonist, I'm always trying to reroute us at the nous. But I mean, in Eastern Christianity, nous, when they use that word now, they translate it as the heart. And I don't know when that happened in the tradition, but so you have the fundamental intellectual principle from Aristotle being now spoken of as heart. And David, do you know when that started? I have no idea.
I don't, but I mean, it's interesting. Aristotle points to the heart as the seat of perception,
Mm-hmm.
which is really interesting. I would love to see some cognitive scientific work on that because apparently there I mean, perception, the heart is involved in perception in ways that um, uh, you know haven't always been recognized. We always think of principally that the brain is operating perception. The heart has, I mean, insofar as that's the thing. I mean, insofar as any human operation is vital, it's going to involve the heart. I mean, the heart is the first mover of the organism, as Aristotle says. But it's also biblical language. I mean, what the heart means is your fundamental orientation towards reality. I mean, that's exactly what you're saying, John. That is what the heart means, and it's both the center of my being. It's the unity of my spiritual soul. So it absolutely includes the intellect in all of its rationality. So it's not opposed to reason in the least. It has to include the whole of reason, but integrated into the center, that it's also the place where the other is most present to me.
Yeah.
So I think it's a sort of a remarkable. But with you mentioned von Hildebrand's book. When I was starting down this path, I thought that's the book I need to read. Here's a philosopher who's talked about it. It just did nothing. I mean, there are things about his philosophy that I admire, but that book did not. It just seemed to me it conceded too much to. It's the seat of the emotions, really, for him. That's not adequate.
So, gentlemen, I'm going to have to intervene here because we're really extended. I'm going to invite you right now both back because I want to talk more about this, and I want to talk about intelligibility and where does it fit in with the other transcendentals. It seems to me that it's being presupposed by the other transcendentals in a really powerful way, and I think it's our primary mark of realness. We real is a comparative. We always compare like this is an illusion compared to that, and so forth. It's a comparative, and it's a comparative about intelligibility. The wooden stick is a real stick compared to the shadow stick because I can use the wooden stick to explain the shadow stick and not vice versa. And so I want to talk about the intelligibility and more about the stuff we've been talking about here. So I want to invite you both back. And I hope you'll both come back and we can continue doing this. And maybe that won't be enough, another one. But I think this has been really fruitful. What we have to do now is go to potential questions that people who've hung with us for all this time might have. So I'm going to open things up to Ben and ask if we have any questions from the chat or from YouTube that we could potentially answer here. Yes. We're listening to Ben right now, so everybody. So we're not just being. He's reading stuff. It'll come up on the screen. I'll read it out, and then we'll field the question. Hi, this is an odd question. I'm writing fiction. Wanted to know if it's possible to reject both religion and the material world both for a nihilistic character who can't take any first principles on faith. So I'm going to answer first because it's my privilege as the host. I think it was done, and Dostoevsky did it with notes from the Underground Man. And I remember I had my son read the Underground, notes from the Underground, and he goes, "I hate the Underground Man," and I go, "Yep, that's right. That's the response you're supposed to have. That is exactly what he was after." I think it's been done and done very well by Dostoevsky, and I think Dostoevsky gives a very clear portrayal of that. I think ultimately Desmond is right. I think there's a performative contradiction at the heart of nihilism. We couldn't possibly know nihilism was true unless there was self-transcendence, unless there was participation, unless there was intelligibility, and unless we had some pre-theoretical commitment to them. I take that argument to be very powerful. And I think Desmond's right about that. And I think what Dostoevsky does in fiction is show that the Underground Man is living out that performative contradiction, and it is tearing him apart and destroying everybody whose life he touched. But that's my comment. I want to hear what each one of you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, Nietzsche is an interesting example. I mean, in Twilight of the Idols, he tells the fable of the two worlds, you know, being in the real world and the apparent world, and tells the history of Western thought as a split and then a growing division between these. And he takes himself to be the final stage. We get rid of the spiritual realm, you know, we get rid of being, and he says, so what are we left with? It's not. He says, it's, you know, are we left with the apparent realm? No. When we get rid of being, we get rid of appearance. He wanted to get rid of both the spiritual and the material in a way, because both for Nietzsche they depend on each other, precisely as opposites. And you know, that's a very simplistic way of characterizing it. But I think in a way he did try to live. I mean, it is a performative contradiction. There's no way that you can. I mean, it will inevitably be performative contradiction. But it is interesting to think about Nietzsche as someone who tried as consistently as possible, and it can't be an accident that he lost his mind. I mean, that he that if you know, if he had not lost his mind, he would represent the greatest challenge to meaning that the world has ever seen, I think.
But I think one of the reasons that especially Catholic philosophers enjoy reading Nietzsche so much is that he's thorough, but he's so thorough that his critique is all the other attempts at nihilism. That's the real subject of his critique. You know, it doesn't take much to respond to Nietzsche from a classical realist or a Christian realist perspective. What it really takes a lot of effort to respond to him with is from any of those middling positions in modernity that he's undermining. And I think part of that is because as magnificent as Nietzsche is, the real, and this speaks to the question that was just asked, the real foundation of the modern age is not Nietzsche, which is a kind of mature late stage reflection on what's happened over the course of 400 years. It's Thomas Hobbes. And the assumption, the Hobbesian assumption, is that you don't have to affirm anything, any being as good. In fact, you can't affirm any being as good, because goodness is a velleity of the will that's destined to change at any moment. The only way you can establish some kind of universal, almost universal account of reality is to assume that it's a machine, and that it's a machine whose stopping we fear. And so then human life, from ethics to politics, gets organized around fear, the fear of death. And you, I think Hobbes is the really the better progenitor of modernity, precisely because there's this contentment, or attempt at contentment, with mere materiality, that then tries to rationally rule out the possibility of any other kind of contentment, which is successful only at the cost of saying that even the contentment for which I am arguing is not good. Mm-hmm. You just fear other things worse, particularly death. And before Hobbes writes, there's Shakespeare's King Lear, which goes through the whole exercise, but it actually arises at despair, where Lear proclaims to the idiot, poor Tom of Bedlam on the heath, he says, thou art the thing itself, man itself, a poor, bare, forked animal, such as thou art. That's, and then that drives him mad. But everything that Lear says in that and other passages when he's mad gets re-articulated as not only perfectly rational, but the only possible rational account of reality in Hobbes' Leviathan.
Yeah.
What Nietzsche does is takes us back to the heath. He says, well, actually, you can't give a rational, content account of these things, that they will lead to your despair. So where does that leave the question of your audience member? I guess what you said, that Dostoevsky did it first.
Okay, great. That was excellent. That was a powerful insight, both about Hobbes and Nietzsche. Thank you, James. I appreciated that. Not that you haven't said other insightful things. That just really struck me powerfully. Maybe we can take another question, Ben. Okay, Christians say suffering is a good. Is suffering then a good in itself? Since I'm not the Christian and the three of us, I will wait and let the Christians go first and let them speak on their own behalf. So whichever one of you wants to go first. Christians say suffering is a good. Is suffering then a good in itself?
I mean, yeah. Christians don't say suffering is a good naturally. I mean, I think that's a certain deformed kind of Christianity, and one can trace it. One can do a genealogy where that comes from. Suffering can become good when it is embraced as a way of an expression of love, but the love is set not on the suffering itself, but on the thing loved, the embrace of which requires suffering. So, compassion for someone who's suffering entails taking on their suffering yourself, but you wouldn't call that a good, or and certainly not a good in itself. I mean, the interesting thing is, the moment you make it a good in itself, you actually turn it into an expression of narcissism. I mean, it becomes kind of autoerotic in a really bizarre sort of way. So that's a perversion that I think is unfortunately often confused by Christians and with Christianity, but it's certainly not the real thing, I would suggest.
Yeah. The in Flannery O'Connor's short story Parker's Back, Parker, who hates all suspicions of what he calls long views, meaning anything that transcends the body, gets himself his first tattoo. He'll eventually cover his whole body with tattoos in an effort to make himself happy, a thing of beauty. But when he gets his first tattoo, I think the sentence that follows it is, "It hurt just enough to make it worth doing." So there's a kind of attraction to the sting of suffering. But what David said is correct. It would obscure the cross entirely if we were to say, but look at this good suffering on the cross. That's the full horror of the cross that's supposed to be born into us. Otherwise it would be easy to do. It would not be a sacrifice at all. That question touches home in a particular way for me, and that is, as I've sort of worked my way through the tradition, it's always been hand in hand. Plato and Scripture, Saint Augustine being a real guide for me, and there's one temptation to which I've sometimes risked succumbing, I think, which is to put the whole account of the human drama on the back of Eros. That the story of human life is the story of this ascent from the contingent to the absolute, from yearning to fulfillment, and that it's a peaceful ascent, like Dante ascending through the heavens in paradise, in the Paradiso. What I didn't always take into account, and it's actually another former colleagues of David's and mine that really brought this home to me, is thumos, is the necessity of that we don't just have a sensuous appetite and an intellectual appetite. We have a concupiscible appetite. We have an appetite to overcome what stands in the way of the good. And so it's only because suffering so often plays a role in our triumphing over obstacles on our way to the good that we might be tempted to think of it as a good in itself, but that would be to misunderstand it. Let me say one more word about this, actually, because this is when I first started listening to your work, John. It was, I came to you through listening to Jordan Peterson, and what I found so fascinating about him early on is that he was overturning everything I thought, in one key respect, everything I thought had to be done in order to make a proper account of human life to contemporary human beings. And here's what I mean by that. For 200 years, you have a deontological conception of Christianity, that Christianity is an obedience to the law, and that goodness is simply obedience to the law. But of course, through MacIntyre and through the recovery of the ancient world, we get the teleological conception of human life. Well, actually, human life is not just mere obedience to law. Law is actually secondary to it. It's the orientation of the soul to its true good, of the person to its true good, which is happiness, that actually explains everything, including those laws that we may obey. And so I thought all we need to do to explain to modern people why they're so wayward and lost is they don't understand the nature of eros and the orientation of us to our enteleki, to our true end. But then you get people like Peterson say, well, maybe we're not made for happiness. Maybe we're made just to get out of bed in the morning and tie our shoes and make our bed and suffer through the day, but heroically. And I think what he's getting at there that's really quite just is that even if that classical vision of the soul being oriented to its end, to its true happiness, is the true and final account of things, we have to recognize that movement towards happiness, more often than not, and in fact, in all instances, will entail immense encounters with suffering and defeat and frustration, and that those things actually deserve a certain kind of reverence or respect in our account of human life. They're not simply obstacles to be set to the side. They actually end up being pretty central to the human drama after all, even if they're not final.
Okay, well, that was two very good, excellent answers. I'm going to give a Zen answer, integrating Taoism and Buddhism, and say, well, let's first remember that suffering doesn't originally mean pain or conflict. Suffering means to undergo, to allow. Suffer the little children to come unto me. And that if if beings were only for, this is David's work, if beings were only for themselves, we would be trapped in the nightmare of perpetual absurdity and alienation. And if everything, but if they, right, but if they were just for me, then I could subsume them into my subjectivity, and I would be stuck in the nightmare of skepticism and solipsism. It's because they are simultaneously for themselves and for others. And suffering is the inevitable state of beings that are for themselves and for others. And I think that is an intrinsic good, because I think that that is the property of ontonormativity, the goodness of being, is that it it is perpetually fulfilling its promise of saving us from these two nightmares: the nightmare of an inescapable subjectivity, and a nightmare of an inapproachable objectivity. And I think that is something that um, I that I'm not saying pain is good. I'm not saying its conflict is good, but pain and conflict, there's a Zen approach, point us towards the deeper notion. The Tao is the well that is never used up. That what we're talking about is, we're talking about a fundamental feature of being, that things are simultaneously for themselves and for each other. And our suffering is um, a the stuff we call suffering, the pain and the conflict, points to the deeper sense in which, as David quoted William Desmond, the conatus ascendi ultimately depends on the passio ascendi, and that cannot be removed from realness, to my mind. And to remember that, I'm not giving a theodicy here. I'm not doing that, but I'm saying how I would respond. I would say there is an aesthetic from the Zen tradition that says, right, that you can understand pain and conflict as pointing us towards this deeper aspect that is in of itself intrinsically good. So that would be an answer I would offer.
Yeah, just real quick, that your account of suffering there, that's the initial receptivity of the person to knowledge. It's the fact that we come second in being, so that we're always suffering first is the case. And of course, Dionysius the Areopagite speaks of communion with God as to suffer things divine. So
Mothane is pathane. Yeah. The key. Yeah. Yeah. And it's not just that the pain, I mean, pain can be sweet to us precisely for that reason. The very pain is a sign of our closeness to what we love, our relatedness. So that, you know, there is a reason why we can cherish even the pain, but I mean, but that presents a temptation to idolize it and be stuck with it, and then make it the point, and try to make ourselves suffer so that we are reminded of the other, and that's a total perversion of the order.
I think we can appreciate tears of joy without becoming the Marquis de Sade. So,
that's right.
So maybe we'll take one more question, please, Ben. If the sages are not making the atmosphere in the room better, what are they doing?
Sounds like the beginning of a joke, or a riddle. Riddle me this.
Which one of you would like to go first? If the sages are not making the atmosphere in the room better, what are they doing? I'm tempted to say, here's where I go. I would I would call Da Costa, that meaning, intelligibility, that the way in which the grammar of cognition and the grammar of reality are coupled together in relevance realization, that is the atmosphere that we live in. He uses that metaphor, and it's both we inspire it and we aspire, but it also does what the atmosphere does. It diffracts light and makes things visible for us in a certain way. And meaning is the atmosphere in which we live and move and have our being. That's why I want to talk about it next time we're together. The primordiality, David, I want to propose to you the primordiality of meaning as another potential superlative. And here again, you can hear the Taoist background. And so I think we are trying to make the atmosphere in the room better. um, uh, insofar as we are seriously playing with the machinery of meaning and trying to get it to disclose through the true, the good, and the beautiful what is most real, to make human lives more capable of that integration and contact that is goes into realization that we know from good research is at the core of meaning. Meaning is to be connected to something more real than yourself, larger than yourself, in an intimate, ongoing, correcting fashion. And I think that is what we have. um, I, I, you two can correct me, but that seems to be a guiding normativity in everything we've been doing. Exactly that. That's why I wanted to bring it back to the phenomenological. I wanted to bring it back to experiences of meaning, is because I want to be able to say this is how this is how you practice what we have been talking about here.
We didn't talk about the third part of my book on mythos and logos,
We
but
will. We
but
will.
one of the things that I most wanted to convey in that section of the book, and it's worth conveying just because of that question, which I didn't understand at first, and I thought, oh, okay, now I got it. Is that is is that one of the modern consequences of disengagement or detachment is to think of the intellectual life as a parallel path that stands apart from reality and day-to-day life, but that what the ancients showed us, and what Christian monasticism shows us, is that actually the intellectual life intellectuality is a way of life. It's a reorientation of yourself to the world. We're already oriented to the world by way of knowing. We reorient ourselves to it when we acknowledge that, and therefore make ourselves open to the reception of reality. And that's what every monastic discipline is doing. Every contemplative discipline, whether it's the academic philosopher, at least at his best, or the monk in the monastery, or the Christian in the pew of a church praying before the Eucharist. It's entirely about not a series of abstract operations of the mind, but a resituation of the self in being, so that you will ever after have a new relationship to it. It's a new way of life. And hopefully it's not an insufferable way of life, although Socrates tells us that or shows us that it can be kind of insufferable.
Yeah, to pick up with Socrates there, another thing that I've been thinking a whole lot about lately is authority. And in a very different way than we normally think of authority as, we think of the authority as just someone who's in charge, who has the power, that everybody has to listen to what he says. So we think of it in practical terms as kind of imposing order. But I think I think we've lost a much more profound sense of authority, which I think is what Nietzsche was looking for, actually. And I also have come to understand that this is what the philosopher's return to the cave is all about. And I think that this is what a sage represents, from a religious tradition, a kind of a person who embodies in his being a vision of reality, but embodies it quite concretely. So that I like the imagery of the atmosphere in the room. You think of an authority as someone who opens up a world that inspires. Somebody who's a life of a party. You've got everybody there. You've got the beer. You've got the sweaty meat and cheese kind of display. And you've got everything for a party. But it's, you need somebody who comes, who is the life of the party. So the heart of the party comes, and suddenly, through the radiance of his being, opens it up for everyone, and everyone in the room finds it easier to talk to each other because this life has sort of entered I think that that's what an authority is meant to be, both very concretely in a family, in a room, in an organization, but also politically speaking and religiously speaking, is meant to, in a way, illuminate the atmosphere, give it life, and through the radiance of um, truth, beauty, and goodness, these sort of transcendent, the meaningfulness of things is channeled through him, as it were. I think that that is a way that the sage makes the atmosphere better.
And that's a great allusion to Socrates, because he definitely
Yeah.
was frequently the life of the party. That's how he shows up at the symposium, for sure. Um, well, gentlemen, we're just ending for now. James, we need you. I need you to come back, because we have to talk about reason, and your proposal to get us away from what was the pejorative term, defecated reason, that, that modernity has saddled us with. And of course, David, this is a theme of your work, the Catholicity of reason. It's a theme of my work, and it's bound up with this question of meaning, and intelligibility, and the relationship between meaning and truth, something that's emphasized by some Eastern Orthodox thinkers like Yanaris and others, that we shouldn't be talking about truth if we're not talking about meaning, and meaning is properly communal in nature, and things like that. So I want to invite you back, that will pick up those themes.
Great.
Always very happy to come back, John, whenever.
Yeah, sure.
Just say the word.
Yeah. All right. It's great to be here with you guys. It's a wonderful conversation.
So I would like now to thank both of you. This has been fantastic. And I always give my guests the last word. We'll reverse the order. We'll do James, then David. Any last words you want to leave with people who are watching? Wait a minute. I'm going to shamelessly promote your books again. Here's the Vision of the Soul. Here's Love in the Postmodern Predicament, and Plato's Critique of Impure Reason. And there's my book, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So there we go. Okay, so James, you first.
I'm going to say something as my last word that actually I meant to state in the first point I made earlier today about awakening to the first light of being, and that's when you approach life at any stage, one of the great things to do is to always do it in the spirit with which, as a child, you found a marshland plants and you immediately peeled back the outside of it so you could discover what was inside of that plant. That's, it ends up being something a little spongy, right? But that's one of the great visions, I think, of what it means to dwell and to abide in wonder, is just being willing to pluck some tall grass or a pussy willow from the marsh and open it up and look at it and discover the mystery inside of it. So hop to it, everybody.
Yes. My last word is just to remember, I think the first time I ever saw The Quiet Man, James, was at your house. I think that was my introduction. But I just an expression of gratitude. There is something about community. The mediated through a screen is not quite the same thing as the direct contact of the blade of grass out in the bright under the bright sun. But I hope someday that we can all meet under the bright sun.
I would dearly love that. Thank you, my friends, and thank you, Ben, for keeping us safe from the imp of the perverse. And thank you all for your time.